The more and more I think about Higehiro, the more and more strange my overall judgment on it becomes. On one hand, there's nothing that's terrible about it. The worst thing that I can say about Higehiro is that it's a little boring. But on the other hand, there's nothing about it that's really exceptional in any way. There's an interesting premise at hand, but the anime doesn't explore it quite enough outside of a few sparks of good ideas here and there. The main characters are fine, but the side characters aren't incredible. Again, they're not bad, and just like the entire anime, the worst part about them is that they're a little boring. Ultimately, what Higehiro has is mostly solid and delivers a look into a unique situation of two people coming together from very different backgrounds that are both equally lacking direction in their lives, with them finding comfort and stability in the presence of the other. That being said, a lot of it ends up being very ordinary and mundane. There will be spoilers for the Higehiro anime, but not the light novel or the manga from here on out. For anyone that's unfamiliar with or straight up never heard of Higehiro before, the title of this video is probably a little weird. Higehiro is short for Hige o soru soshite joshi kosei o hiro, which translates to, after being rejected, I shaved and took in a high school runaway. This story is rather self-explanatory when you look at the title. Yoshida, after having been rejected by his boss Goto, gets drunk and is on the way home when he sees a girl beneath a lamplight. This girl is Sayu Ogiwara, who ran away from home several months before the events of Higehiro. She had been putting a roof over her head during that time by offering to sleep with men in exchange for a temporary place to stay. She attempts to repeat this process with Yoshida, but Yoshida, being the right and honorable gentleman he is, rejects her offer but brings her home anyways and offers her a place to stay as long as she does the chores around the apartment. That right there is a summary of pretty much the entirety of episode 1 and is where the story begins. I said it during the introduction and I'll say it again here and probably again throughout the rest of the video. Higehiro has an interesting premise. There's a decent contrast between how boring and unsatisfying Yoshida's life is and the more unstable and unpredictable life that Sayu had been leading for a little while. And despite the somewhat silly nature of the title, it provides a rather dark background to Sayu's character to work off of at the start. We'll get back to this premise shortly, as I think it's important to discuss some of the characters before we dive too far deep. I think Sayu provides a unique perspective to view other characters and situations through, even if they didn't necessarily click with me at first and required me to rewire my thoughts a little. The greatest example of this would come with episode 3. One of the things Sayu struggles greatly with at first is that apparently Yoshida is too kind. In fact, he's so kind to her that she can't fathom this kindness to such a point that she feels no value without offering to sleep with him. The kindness that overwhelms Sayu is that Yoshida is just a decent human being who treats her with respect. I had a really hard time grasping this idea at first, and to be perfectly honest, thought it was kind of silly and just used as a method to put some fan service on screen. But after thinking about it, things came together pretty well. The main point that needs to be understood by the viewer is that before the events of Higehiro, Sayu hasn't had a lot of positive experiences with men, at least ever since she ran away from home. It's also emphasized that Sayu in the earlier episodes shows a tendency to change her behavior on the fly to keep other people as happy as possible. Therefore, Yoshida being a decent human being is seemingly too much for her given that her expectations were rock bottom, which led to her doing the only thing that has given her the smallest scrap of influence over the last few months by offering herself to Yoshida. I think that this sequence of events in episode 3 highlights the unique position that Sayu finds herself in over the course of Higehiro and how this position affects her perspective, even though this isn't something that is explored much deeper outside of this episode. One of the key things to highlight throughout Higehiro is the increasing stability that Yoshida and Sayu gain in their lives by being around each other. Yoshida's sense of stability is okay, if a bit on the plain side. It's mostly relegated to his outward appearance looking better and some of his behavior at work changing a bit, which his coworkers repeatedly remind him of. Meanwhile, Sayu's sense of stability comes in the form of establishing a very set routine of doing chores on a daily basis at Yoshida's place. While that itself is mostly unimportant, the stability provided to her by this routine means she no longer needs to constantly be chasing for a new roof over her head every couple of days, which then allows her to explore more options she never got to experience due to her past circumstances, such as getting a part-time job or going to a local festival. And yes, these kinds of things are very ordinary, but I'm just pointing them out to emphasize the stability rather than to say whether or not these events are actually interesting. Sayu's backstory is something I ultimately have mixed feelings on. I think it has some good concepts that I wish were explored a little better, even if her overall backstory feels like it fits together very loosely. In short, Sayu's only friend in high school was a girl named Yuko. After Sayu turns down a girl who liked said guy, and her friends begin to bully Yuko because according to the bullies, Yuko supposedly was friends with Sayu only because that would make Yuko more attractive. This bullying eventually pushes Yuko to the brink of suicide, with her reason being that she ruined Sayu's image of being solitary and beautiful and that she wants Sayu to be happy again. Once the news of Yuko's suicide becomes more public, Sayu's mother pins the blame onto Sayu and even asks Sayu if she killed Yuko. So there are two parts to this backstory that I think are pretty good. The first and the most easy one to point out is that Sayu's mother's reactions to the news of Yuko's suicide is very negative, and she says some truly awful things to Sayu. The tone of that scene does a solid job in making Sayu's home a very undesirable place and gives credit towards her reasons for running away. The second is the change in mindset that occurs in Yuko. I think the idea of Yuko being bullied to such a degree that it causes a drastic change in her mindset in both how she views herself and Sayu is, as dark and tragic as it is, an interesting one that is developed on decently throughout the backstory, although I wished it was explored a bit more, maybe by extending the overall length of the time in which Sayu tells her backstory. For parts of her backstory that are not so good, we have the actual reasoning for Yuko getting bullied. Sayu rejecting someone, then a girl that likes that someone bullying not Sayu but Yuko, with the claim that Yuko is trying to gain attraction by being friends with Sayu feels like a loose chain of reasons that I don't quite follow. Apparently, Sayu was too cool and pretty to be bullied according to Yuko, which again doesn't feel like something that clicks into place when compared to why Yuko was getting bullied to begin with. Sure, Yuko does adore Sayu, and my best guess would have to be that maybe the reasoning is as shallow as it is because it might be meant to reflect how little control Sayu had over the entire situation. I understand that the intention of this backstory was to put Sayu in a unique position where she was helpless but still remained ultimately involved in the death of someone else. Even though I think the end result of this is successful enough thanks to the interaction between Sayu and her mother, the process of connecting the dots to get there feels weak. The sequence on the rooftop in episode 11 helps fortify this weakness by offering some more details from Sayu's perspective on her entire backstory, but it's not quite enough to fully connect the loose links. Overall, Sayu is the best character in the anime by virtue of having the most distinct past that gets brought up periodically to help facilitate a few moments. If it weren't for that, I really don't think there would be any noteworthy characters to talk about in Higehiro. Moving on to Yoshida, I think he's okay. He's certainly serviceable for the purposes of Higehiro, and I don't mind that he isn't the most enthralling character with the biggest emotional ups and downs. After all, he is meant to be a super normal guy that happens upon a unique circumstance which sets the stage for the rest of Higehiro's events to unfold. His backstory in 7 is interesting enough as well. If I had to pick one highlight moment in regards to Yoshida, it would also be from episode 7 when Mishima tells him off for how Yoshida always does things the way he wants to do them but convinces himself that he's doing it for the good of others. This is a shocking piece of criticism aimed at Yoshida from who is probably his biggest fan throughout the entire anime, which maybe makes this more of a highlight for Mishima than Yoshida. Anyways, this scene stood out to me because the anime, aside from the first episode, has displayed Yoshida under a mostly positive light, so the negativity and who it comes from makes it stand out a little more. It does also display a bit of what is mostly inconsequential change in Yoshida's behavior as well in the long term, so there's that too. The only problem I have with this character is that the anime likes to really go out of its way to hammer home the point that Yoshida is nice. Yes, learning to receive kindness is one of the themes of the anime, there's pretty much no way to deny that, but there's no real need for it to be repeated by so many characters. The side characters are decent but not exceptional, but the two main characters are good enough that this mostly wasn't a significant problem aside from the occasional boredom. Goto is decent at the start given that she gives off a mysterious aura at the beginning of the anime because we don't know her reason for constantly asking Yoshida to dinner and being so inquisitive with him. That is, until the reason is revealed that Goto happens to like Yoshida as well, and once the veil drops, I don't think Goto remains a very interesting character. The aura she had at the start drops off and she suddenly doesn't stand out as a character anymore. Her one-on-one conversation with Sayu is decent but doesn't really shed any light onto anything new. Asumi provides an opportunity of optimism and energy into the series that was very nice to have given that most of the other characters don't really deliver on this front. Yoshida is a mostly muted and subtle character while Sayu is a mix of positivity and negativity depending on the scenario. The closest I could say would be Mishima, but even then Mishima has her moments of negativity and sadness. It's also good that Asumi is the first recurring character of any major significance to come from Sayu's side rather than from Yoshida's side like most of the other side characters have. Her backstory is also good, and I'd rate her as the best out of all of Higehiro's side characters, but that never was too much of a contest to begin with. I would rate Mishima somewhere above Goto but under Asumi. On one hand, I think her proactive approach towards interacting with Yoshida makes for some okay moments and even sets a decent contrast to Goto's approach of just letting things happen. On the other hand, just how much she gets upset over Yoshida and Sayu's growing relationship is a little weird to me given that Mishima and Sayu have vastly different circumstances that would affect her relationship with Yoshida. What I think it's meant to do is provide a bit of irony between her telling Sayu about the hardships of receiving kindness in episode 3 and her present jealousy on being unable to receive the same kindness, which is fine. It's an interesting twist to a character that has largely been optimistic even if I do find it a little weird. The only other real piece of criticism I have for her would be that for all the screen time she's given, Mishima's character doesn't feel like it contributes a whole lot to the story outside of when she told off Yoshida that one time in episode 7. So that's everything for the characters. Now that we've covered them, I think we can return to talking about the premise of Higehiro once again. Despite the unique nature of Higehiro's premise granted to it thanks to Sayu's background, it doesn't feel like something that the anime takes full advantage of. It has inklings of it, with Sayu experiencing and adjusting to the cycles of day-to-day life after having been through a long period of instability. And even though I'm not super comfortable saying this, one could even argue that at the most extreme, any fan service related to Sayu is a throwback to her recent past. But even with this, I don't think the anime manages to create very many riveting scenarios that derive from her past aside from a few moments. Episode 3 would be the first of 2 examples on this front, and it's one we've already looked into when talking about Sayu overall. Even though the episode is pretty heavily laden with fanservice, the overall conversation at the end of the episode is solid in terms of Sayu's insecurity coming as a consequence of her past. Episode 6 is what I would consider to be the best episode of the anime because not only does it provide the most direct connection with her past, but it also shows how that connection leads to a change in her perspective in the present and future. Episode 6 presents a confrontation between Sayu and one of her co-workers at the convenience store who happens to be one of the men that she stayed with in the past. He blackmails her into taking him back to Yoshida's place while Yoshida isn't home, and while he's there tries to force himself upon Sayu. Yoshida manages to arrive just on time to save the day. Sayu having to confront a piece of her past is really interesting because I never expected it to be as direct as it is, and especially because it ties back in with a little flashback from a few episodes ago that was almost entirely irrelevant before this episode. Even though the guy is as scummy as ever and he blackmails her into bringing him to Yoshida's place, I think the forceful nature of it helps highlight Sayu's gloomy past and the dire situation she was thrown into. And yes, Yoshida manages to arrive just at the perfect time, which I probably would have actually minded if it weren't for the anime actually using Sayu's inability to save herself from the situation later on in the episode as a focal point. Another thing that becomes noteworthy to highlight that returns later is that Sayu's main reason for giving herself up to the guy is because she doesn't want Yoshida to get busted for it if the news gets out. This, in my mind, acts as a callback to Sayu's previous tendencies of doing whatever she could to keep the person she was staying with happy. My main problem with this section, and my only problem with the episode as a whole, is that just because the guy decided to hold up his end of the deal by staying quiet about their past, Sayu's response to his apology is that he's pretty weird. Maybe something was just lost in translation when it came to the subtitles, but given how serious the situation was the day before, this is a shockingly light response that I can't say I feel comfortable with reading. It's not something that dramatically alters the story or anything as far as I can tell, and is more of a personal problem than anything else, but I thought it was still worth writing in. At the very end of the episode, Sayu goes on to say that thanks to what Yoshida has provided to her, she's now able to look forward to the future more rather than being stuck in her past. Given her past where she was having to look for a new roof over her head every couple of days, her focus was very understandably on the here and now and just trying to get by while being haunted by her past. Only after meeting Yoshida was she finally able to acquire some degree of stability in her life, and even during those times it wasn't always super clear because she has frequently stated her worries about losing this roof over her head as well. Once she develops a level of trust in Yoshida, she no longer needs to worry about the present, and thanks to this, she can finally start looking forward to where she will be going. By linking the past, present, and the future of Sayu's circumstances effectively together in a chain of events that is only unique to Higehiro's premise, this helped to mark episode 6 as the standout episode of the anime for me. I wish I could say that the other episodes lived up to this level of connection seen in episode 6, but none of the other ones quite get there. Sayu's past, present, and future are 3 very different scenarios that need to be distinguished apart but are not completely divorced from one another. Episode 6 shows evidence of being able to keep each of these 3 elements unique while having them all tied together. The last few episodes have a heavy emphasis on the past and have a solid idea as their focus. Meanwhile, the early episodes are more of a group of loosely connected individual episodes that all have an okay premise but ultimately didn't end up being too engaging. For example, in episode 5, Goto comes over to visit Sayu. They have a conversation about what Sayu plans to do about her future, which is nice and all, but doesn't really amount to much in the long run. While it brings up elements of the past, present, and future, it ends up melting them all together rather than having them remain distinctly separate while closely linked. In episode 2, Yoshida buys Sayu a new phone. There's theories of Yoshida having a girlfriend and the mention of Sayu forcing herself to smile to keep people around her happy. The second idea is brought up a few more times across the next few episodes, but that's really about it, with nothing too substantial that comes out of it. Episode 2 also suggests the idea of a romantic plotline between Sayu and Yoshida. Given their age gap, I can understand if the mere mention of it makes people uncomfortable, but again, this isn't something that is too deeply explored in the long run. Whenever somebody brings the idea up to Yoshida, he always denies it, and while there is a renewed focus on it in the final episode, it's not something that feels as integral to the plotline as it initially seemed for me. Episode 2 contains a lot of individual threads that don't tie together in any real way, and while each of these threads aren't bad per se, they don't support one another either. The most interesting single aspect of Higehiro might just be the Ogiwara family dynamic introduced in the back half of the anime, which begins with episode 8 and pretty much runs through every single episode from there to the end. Sayu's mother is portrayed well in the sense that she comes off as an incredibly despicable person from all the awful things she says to Sayu and the way she says it to her. Her brother makes for a solid contrast as he is more patient and understanding with Sayu even if he doesn't understand the full extent of the scenario, and his reveal made for a decently pleasant twist given how before it, Sayu described her home in an exclusively negative way. The larger picture of the Ogiwara family history is great as well, with how Sayu's father was cheating on her mother while she was pregnant with Sayu, and her mother gave birth to Sayu in the hopes of making him stay. This didn't work out, so Sayu's mother became extremely bitter towards Sayu as Sayu became proof that her husband didn't love her anymore. This made for a really good bit of backstory that helped expand the Ogiwara family dynamic in terms of both scope and depth, and is something that is reflected well in the interactions between Sayu and her mother later on. I used the word mundane to describe how I felt about Higehiro during the introduction to this video, and that honestly is the best word that I have for it. Without any explanation, it simply just sounds like another way to say Higehiro is boring. While I find that to be true every now and then, I really do mean it when I say that I'm not using the word mundane as a form of criticism towards the anime. It's not a compliment either. Higehiro depicts Sayu going from her unstable past of having to look for a new roof over her head constantly to a more stable life under Yoshida's roof involving the monotony of daily routines. This monotony is periodically marked by Sayu experiencing things she never got to in the past, such as getting a part-time job or going to a festival, or her occasional interaction with people from outside of the house, such as Goto, Mishima, and Asami. While these sorts of events are different from the usual, there's nothing about them that is surprising or astonishing. But I don't think there was ever meant to be anything like this, possibly outside of episode 6. The end goal of Higehiro was to have Sayu return back to square one, back to a relatively normal life in her home in Hokkaido. And beginning this process involves that return to monotony that I just described. The mundane nature of it is just part of that newfound stability. There might be no better fit for the word mundane than the ending of Higehiro. Sayu returns home, and while things are rough at first, it seems like her mother is willing to be a little more understanding. Yoshida and Sayu have a bittersweet goodbye at the airport, which is followed by a time skip and the final shot depicting Sayu coming to visit Yoshida again under the same lamplight where they first met. It's by no means a bad ending. I think the airport scene and the follow-up of Yoshida being alone in his apartment again for the first time in a while, ending things on a melancholy note, is good, especially because it highlights Yoshida's own return to the ordinary after months of helping Sayu return to the ordinary herself. And yes, the final shot of them reuniting is nice and heartwarming. But the ending is just about what you would have expected. There's no grand reveal or twist at the end, but it doesn't feel like something is missing either. It's just both Sayu and Yoshida readjusting back to their regular lives after having established their odd circumstances as the new norm. I really do think that mundane and ordinary was what Higehiro was aiming for, and all things considered, it was successful even if it wasn't the most interesting experience for me. Higehiro was fine. I know that comes off as a painfully simple conclusion after I spent all those minutes going over it. Higehiro never did anything that was too out of the ordinary or surprising outside of a very few select moments. The mundane nature of it all might not have encapsulated me in a meaningful way, but the simpleness of the story makes for a decent exploration of a character in a unique position. There's nothing about the anime that I really dislike, but there's nothing about it I loved either. I think you could very easily tell that given how much I emphasized that something was decent throughout this video. And as inconclusive and unsatisfactory as that statement is, I think that's where we'll call it with this video. There is no grand revelation or conclusion I have to finish this video off with given how mundane I perceive the anime to be. It might not be the best way to end a video, but I think it might be the best way to illustrate my feelings for Higehiro. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and maybe even subscribing to the channel for more. I'm happy with the progress of the Dynazenon video currently, but since the scope of the project in terms of size and depth has increased greatly over the last month, there's still a lot of work to be done. There should be another video next month similar to this one in length, and after that I'll probably focus on Dynazenon until that video is done. That'll be everything from me, and there should be links on the screen now to some of my other videos in case you want to check them out. Once again, thank you for watching, and I will see you later.